Every night for 3 years, the people of Ash Hollow watched the light flicker in the window of the little sewing shop at the edge of town. And every night they felt nothing but relief that it wasn't their grief burning there. They called Mara Ellsworth brave to her face and pathetic behind her back. They brought her pies she didn't ask for, and pitying smiles she never wanted. They had already decided what her life would look like from here until the end. What they never counted on was the stranger who rode in through the rain and refused to see her the way they did. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this lantern can travel. The storm rolled in from the north the way bad news always did in Ash Hollow, without much warning and with a kind of grim determination that made you think it had been planning the whole thing for days. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of a bad bruise, and the wind was picking up enough that the sign above Mara Ellsworth's sewing shop, hand-painted letters reading M. Ellsworth, Alterations in Dry Goods, had started knocking against the storefront wall with a flat rhythmic bang that she had stopped hearing sometime around the second year of widowhood. Most things became background noise eventually, if you waited long enough. She was hemming a skirt that belonged to Cora Hatch, the wife of the land surveyor, who had dropped it off 3 days ago and not come back yet, which suited Mara fine, because Cora had a habit of standing in the shop and talking too long about nothing while her eyes moved slowly over Mara the way a person takes inventory of something they find faintly troubling. Mara had learned to be busy when Cora talked. She had learned to be busy for a lot of reasons. The needle moved through the fabric steadily, in and out, the way her mother had taught her a long time ago in a kitchen that no longer existed in a town she had not seen in 11 years. She did not think about her mother often. It served no useful purpose. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began hitting the window glass, and the light inside the shop took on the particular quality it always did before a storm. That underwater dimness that made everything feel slightly unreal, slightly suspended, like the world was holding its breath. She heard the horse before she heard the man. The animal came up the main road at a walk, not a trot, which told her the rider wasn't in a hurry or wasn't paying attention. She'd learn later it was somewhere between the two. The hooves were loud on the wet dirt, slow and deliberate, and then they stopped somewhere close enough to the shop that she looked up out of habit. Through the rain-blurred window, she could make out the shape of a man on a bay horse. He sat still for a moment, like he was deciding something. Then he swung down, and she watched him lead the horse toward the hitching post outside Garvey's feed store across the street. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the particular economy of a man who had spent enough years in physical work that his body had stopped wasting effort. His coat was dark with rain across the shoulders. She went back to her hemming. The storm hit hard around 6 o'clock, the kind of rain that turned the street to mud and drove everyone sensible indoors. Mara lit her lamps, both the working lamp at her table and the one in the window. She always lit the one in the window. It had been Thomas's idea, years ago, something he had said once about making sure a house looked like something was alive inside it. And she had kept doing it after he was gone because stopping felt like one more small surrender she wasn't prepared to make. The lamp in the window was one of the few things nobody in Ash Hollow dared to comment on directly, although she knew they talked about it. She had heard what they said. Keeping the light for a dead man. Poor thing, she can't let go. She didn't correct them, mostly because their version was easier to explain than the truth, which was that she lit it for herself because she needed to see the light from the street when she was coming home on dark evenings. Needed some small proof that there was a place she belonged. She was straightening the bolts of fabric along the back wall when the door opened. She'd left it unlatched. She usually did until 8 when she flipped the sign and locked up. And the man from the bay horse came in out of the rain, trailing a cold draft with him. He stopped just inside the threshold, like he was aware he was dripping on her floor. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I was told there might be a saddle maker on this street." His voice was low and rougher than she expected, like a voice that hadn't been used much recently. His eyes moved around the shop with a kind of habitual caution, cataloging exits, she thought, or maybe just old habit, and then landed on her without sliding away. "Henderson's," Mara said. 2 streets over, but he closes at 5. Closed earlier today with the storm." The man nodded. He was older than she'd thought from the window. Maybe 35, maybe more, with the kind of weathered face that made ages hard to guess accurately. He had a week's worth of dark beard growing in, and there was something behind his eyes that she recognized without being able to name it. A person carrying something they had stopped expecting to put down. My saddle strap gave out about 6 miles back, he said. Didn't want to push her with bad gear in weather like this. Smart. She's a good horse. She's earned better. That was an unexpected thing to say. Mara looked at him with slightly more interest. You can leave her at the livery, she said. Tell Amos Pell I sent you. He won't cheat you. Thank you. He didn't move immediately. He looked at the lamp in the window. That direct, steady look again. That's a good lamp you've got there, good light. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. I won't trouble you further, he said. Appreciate it, ma'am. He went back out into the rain, and Mara stood at her fabric table for a moment, her hands loose at her sides, listening to his footsteps move down the wet boardwalk. 1. She'd lived in Ash Hollow for 7 years. She had come with Thomas when they were 24 and full of the particular foolishness that belongs to young people who believe that wanting something hard enough is mostly what it takes. Thomas had seen something in this territory. The space of it, the possibility, the way the frontier rewarded people who were willing to work and willing to wait. He hadn't been wrong. They'd built something real here, the two of them, across 4 years that Mara would not trade for anything she'd experienced since. Their daughter Clara had been 2 years old when the fever came through the territory. She'd been sick for 6 days. On the 7th day, Thomas had come into the bedroom where Mara was sitting beside Clara's small bed, and he hadn't said anything. Just stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she had never seen before and never wanted to see again on anyone. Clara had been buried in the cemetery at the north edge of town, in the hard ground under a plain wooden marker that Thomas had carved himself, because spending money on a fancy stone felt wrong when his hands still worked. Thomas had died 14 months later. His heart, the doctor said, though Mara had her own private theory about what breaks a man enough to make his heart stop working properly. She hadn't said that to anyone because it sounded like the kind of thing a person could argue with, and she didn't have the energy for arguments. So she'd had the shop. Thomas had owned the land and the building. It passed to her without complication, one of the few uncomplicated things about that period. She had turned the front room into a proper alterations and dry goods shop because she could sew, and because she needed an income, and because having somewhere to be in the mornings kept her out of the darkness that came for her when she sat still too long. 3 years of that. 3 years of Ash Hollow's particular brand of small-town kindness, which came laced with a condescension she had learned to absorb without flinching. She was a young widow, which they considered either pitiable or vaguely threatening depending on their own domestic situation. She was a woman running a business alone, which some of them admired and some of them found faintly unnatural. And she was a large woman, had always been large, solid and full-figured in a way that she was simply built and not inclined to apologize for, which gave the cruelest among them a language to use when other cruelties felt too obvious. She had been called Poor Mara so many times she had stopped counting. She had also been called other things, in the way that small towns pass cruelty from person to person in low voices, never quite loudly enough to confront, but always loudly enough to hear. She had heard herself described as let herself go by women who had never once asked what going had looked like for her. She had heard a man at Garvey's store say that it was a wonder Thomas had married her at all, in a tone that suggested he considered this charitable rather than cruel. She had smiled at that man the next time she saw him in the street, which was a different kind of bravery than people gave her credit for. The stranger, she didn't have a name for him yet, was at the counter of Holt's General Store the next morning when she came in for lamp oil and a paper of pins. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her a moment to notice that he looked considerably better after a night's sleep and a meal, though the quality in his eyes had not changed. He was talking to Ed Holt about the road conditions east of town, asking practical questions about distances and terrain, and Ed was answering in his usual unhurried way. Then he turned and saw her, and he nodded the way a person nods to someone they've met before, natural and unceremonious. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Ed Holt watched this brief exchange with a merchant's alertness to all human interaction. "You met our Mara, then," Ed said. "She helped me out last night," the man said, pointed me toward the livery. "Much appreciated. Mara helps most people," Ed said, which was true and also had the faint flavor of something else underneath it, though she couldn't have said exactly what. "Brennan Cade," the man said, and extended his hand to her. She shook it. His grip was firm without performing anything. Mara Ellsworth. Heading west eventually, he said, when she didn't ask, once the strap is fixed. Henderson opens at 8, she said. He's good at what he does. Good to know. She collected her lamp oil and her pins and paid Ed and went back to her shop, and that should have been the end of it. Awesome. It wasn't the end of it because of Silas Crow. Silas Crow was 46 years old and ran the biggest cattle operation in the county, which he treated as a moral accomplishment rather than a commercial one. He was a broad man going soft around the middle, with a red face and small pale eyes, and the absolute conviction of a person who had never been meaningfully contradicted that his opinions were facts and his preferences were rights. He bought and sold livestock through half the territory. He sat on the town council. He had buried 2 wives and was, according to persistent local rumor, looking for a third. He had been looking in Mara's direction for the better part of a year, which she found somewhere between uncomfortable and nauseating, and had handled by being always busy when he appeared in her shop and always just leaving when he appeared on the street. He came in that afternoon. Thursday was apparently one of his days in town, and he came in with 2 of his men, which was more company than he needed for a quick purchase, and which signaled to Mara that he was in an expansive mood. An expansive mood in Silas Crow meant he wanted an audience. She was behind the counter. The shop was not empty. Dottie Aldrin was browsing the ribbon spools near the front, and May Fraser from the boarding house had come in to pick up her mended coat. Both of them stiffened slightly when Silas walked in, which was a common response that he either didn't notice or interpreted as the correct order of things. "Mara," he said, in the familiarly proprietorial tone he'd adopted without her invitation. "I need buttons. Good brass ones, not the cheap kind." "Third shelf, left side," she said. "I'll come help you find the size." She came around the counter. She was wearing her work apron. She always wore her work apron, a practical muslin thing she'd made herself. And she was aware of the small, smirking glance that passed between his 2 men, the kind of look that was designed to be visible to everyone except the subject of it. She had seen that look before. She kept her face pleasant and went to the shelf. "What size buttons, Mr. Crow?" "The big ones," he said, "for a riding coat." She found the right tin and opened it on the counter for him. He leaned over to look, taking up considerably more space than was necessary, and she stepped back to give herself room. "You got a full shop today," he said, looking around as if taking inventory. "I keep busy," she said. He picked up a button, turned it over, put it down. "Heard you had a man in your shop last night." The room went quiet. May Fraser stopped pretending to examine her coat. Mara kept her voice neutral. "I have customers come in most evenings." This one wasn't buying anything, though, was he? It wasn't a question. He was asking directions. I helped him find the livery. Silas picked up another button, and she could see from the angle of his head that he wasn't actually looking at it. He was performing something for his men. "Well, that's charitable of you, Mara. You always been charitable." A pause that stretched slightly too long. "Some might say too charitable, woman alone, letting strange men in after dark." May Fraser drew in a quiet breath. Dottie Aldrin had gone very still near the ribbon spools. Mara felt the heat move up through her chest the way it always did in these moments. The old, helpless anger, the familiar calculation of what she could say and what it would cost her to say it. In a town this size, cost mattered. She had learned that. She had learned to calculate. "I'll wrap the buttons when you've decided on a quantity," she said, which was not the response he was looking for. He set the button tin down with slightly more force than was needed. "You know what your problem is, Mara. You got no sense of how things look. Woman your size." He let the pause do the work, and both his men grinned, and she made herself hold very still. "Ought to be careful who she's inviting in." "I'll take 20 buttons," said a voice from the doorway. They all turned. Brennan Cade was standing in the open door of the shop. He hadn't announced himself. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He was leaning one shoulder against the door frame with his arms folded, in the casual way of someone who had arrived several minutes ago and was in no particular hurry. 20 brass buttons," he said to Mara, as if the shop contained nothing except the 2 of them and the buttons in question. "If you've got them." She looked at the tin. "I've got them." Silas turned his full body toward Brennan, and the expansive mood contracted into something harder. Don't think I've seen you before. No reason you should have, Brennan said. You're new to town. Passing through. Then you don't know how things work around here. Brennan looked at him without any particular change in his expression. Don't need to, he said. I know how things work everywhere. It was such a simple thing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anything. He just stood there in the doorway being entirely unbothered, looking at Silas with the patient attention of a person who has decided they have all the time in the world. And something in that look, the absolute absence of either deference or aggression, seemed to confuse Silas, who was accustomed to one or the other. The moment stretched. Then Silas made a small, contemptuous sound and looked back at Mara. Wrap my buttons, he said, and his voice had lost some of its carrying quality. 40. I'll come back for them Friday. They'll be ready, she said. He left. His men followed. The door swung shut. In the silence that followed, Dottie Aldrin let out a long, careful breath. May Fraser said nothing, but her shoulders had come down from around her ears. Mara stood at the counter with her hands flat on the wood and waited for the shaking she always felt after those encounters to subside. Brennan Cade walked across the shop and put a coin on the counter. I do actually need buttons, he said, without a trace of self-congratulation. I've got a shirt that's missing 3 of them. She looked at him. What size? Medium. Nothing fancy. She found a paper of the right size, counted out 3, and slid them across the counter. He picked them up without examining them, trusted her judgment, which was not nothing. Thank you, she said. She didn't mean for the buttons. Henderson fixed my strap, he said, pocketing the buttons. Good man. Fast work. She should have let him go. It was the sensible thing. Instead, she heard herself say, There's supper going on my stove if you haven't eaten. He looked at her. It's just soup, she said, which was defensive and unnecessary, but she'd said it now. A pause. I don't want to put you out. I made enough for 2. She hadn't, but it was close enough to the truth that the adjustment would be easy. He thought about it, actually thought about it, which she appreciated because the alternative was a man who accepted every invitation without weighing it. All right, he said. Thank you. She lived in the 2 rooms behind the shop, a kitchen and a bedroom and a narrow hallway in between that she had made as comfortable as she could manage over 3 years of small improvements. It was not a fancy house. The kitchen had a good iron stove, a sturdy table, 4 chairs for reasons she could no longer entirely remember, and the accumulated signs of a person living carefully, the dried herbs in the window, the mended curtains, the shelf of books that she had read and reread until their spines gave out. Brennan Cade sat at the table and did not attempt to make himself comfortable in the way some men did, spreading out and expanding into available space. He sat in the chair he'd been given and kept his elbows off the table and didn't offer opinions on her kitchen, which already put him ahead of several people she could have named. She added more broth to the pot and cut more bread and set the table with the practical efficiency of someone accustomed to doing things alone. You been here long? He asked. 7 years. She stirred the pot. Came with my husband. He's still here? He died 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Thank you. She said it the way she always said it, accepting the words without wearing them, because grief wasn't something you explained to strangers, and she had found the simplest response was always the most honest. We had a daughter too. She went before him. He was quiet for a moment, then, that's a lot to carry. Poor shit. Yeah. She said Bantam. Antum. Mountain. Oh, dinner minus. They ate mostly in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. She had forgotten that silence could be comfortable with another person present. Most of the people in her life used silence as a kind of pressure, awaiting for her to say something they could respond to or judge, or file away for later use. Brennan Cade seemed to have no agenda about her silence. He ate his soup and tore his bread and looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard without any apparent need for her to entertain him. "Where are you heading?" she asked after a while. "West," he said. "Eventually." "You said that earlier. Eventually. I'm not in a hurry. Most people passing through are." He thought about that for a moment. Most people passing through have somewhere they're going. She looked at him. "I had somewhere I was going," he said. "It turned out to be somewhere I didn't need to be after all." She didn't press. Whatever had been taken from him, and something had been, she was reasonably certain. He hadn't offered it, and she wouldn't ask. She knew what it felt like to have something you weren't ready to hand over to other people's curiosity. "The man in my shop today," she said instead. "Crow." "You know him?" "I know the type." He set down his spoon. "You get a lot of that?" She considered the question honestly. "Enough." "He's afraid of something." That surprised her. He didn't look afraid. "Men like that always are," Brennan said. "The ones who go out of their way to make other people small, they're always afraid of something. The volume's a cover." She thought about Silas Crow and his pale eyes, and his deliberate way of taking up space. She thought about the glance between his men. "I've never thought of him as afraid," she admitted. "What have you thought of him as?" "Mean," she said. "Mostly mean." Brennan made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a smile. "That too." She cleared the plates. He offered to help and she let him, mostly because it was easier than arguing with someone who had already risen from the table. He washed and she dried, and it was awkward for about 30 seconds, and then it wasn't. "You don't have to leave first thing," she said, when they were done, and immediately felt heat rise in her face because she could hear how it sounded. "The room at the boarding house is cold until May. May Fraser doesn't fix the heating properly until May. I have a storeroom with a cot." He turned to look at her, and to his credit the look was direct and careful, and not at all amused at her expense. "The cot's fine," he said. "Thank you, Mara." She went to get the extra blankets and told herself that offering a cold stranger a cot was simply the decent thing to do and had nothing to do with the fact that for the first time in 3 years, the kitchen had felt like something other than a room she ate alone in. It rained all night and into the next morning. She heard him in the storeroom around 6, the small sounds of a person getting up without trying to disturb anyone, and she was already in the kitchen starting the coffee when he appeared in the doorway. "You didn't have to—" "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's almost ready." He sat down. She made eggs and a second breakfast that she had not been planning to make, and they ate in the same easy silence as the night before. And she thought about how strange it was that a person she had known for less than a day could feel more straightforward than people she had known for years. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." "Why did you stay in the shop yesterday? When Crow was—" She searched for the right word. "Being himself," Brennan said. "You could have come back for the buttons another time." He thought about it. She was beginning to appreciate that he actually thought before he answered, which was not common. "I heard what he was building toward," he said. "I've heard that particular kind of talk before. There are men who get braver as they go along if nothing stops the going. You stopped it without doing anything." "I was just there," he said. "Sometimes that's enough." She looked at her coffee cup. "You didn't know me. You don't know me now. Not really." "No," he agreed, "but that's got nothing to do with it." She thought about Thomas, who had been a man of similar economy, a person who said exactly what he meant without dressing it up or pulling it apart. She hadn't thought she would encounter that particular quality in anyone else in her remaining years, and she felt a complicated thing about encountering it now in this stranger at her kitchen table, with the rain still falling outside and the lamp in the shop window burning through the gray morning. She didn't examine the feeling. She had learned to be cautious with feelings that arrived without invitation. "You plan to stay in Ash Hollow long?" she asked, clearing the dishes. "Don't know," he said honestly. "That's not an answer. That's the only answer I've got right now." She nodded. She understood the limitations of right now better than most. By By the time the storm had completely moved through and the sun came back, Brennan Cade had been in Ash Hollow 4 days. He wasn't in her shop, and he wasn't living in her storeroom. He'd moved to the boarding house after the first night, which was correct and proper, and she hadn't said anything to the contrary. But he came to the shop in the mornings and sometimes sat with the coffee she made between customers and read or said nothing. And in the afternoons, he found work helping Amos Pell at the livery, and she knew this because the town was not large. She also knew, because the town was not large, that his presence was being noticed. The first indication came from Dottie Aldrin, who arrived ostensibly to pick up a repaired hem, but who spent a considerable amount of time examining Mara's face for signs of something she could report back accurately. "He's taking his meals at May's," Dottie said, with an air of passing information that had been costly to obtain. "That's reasonable," Mara said. "May sets a good table. He's over here most mornings, though." Dottie touched a bolt of blue calico without purpose. "He has coffee here sometimes. He's a customer." Dottie's expression suggested that this was either an innocent explanation or a very clever one, and she hadn't yet decided which. "People are talking," she said, which was the most honest thing anyone in Ash Hollow had ever said to Mara directly. "People always are," Mara said. "That'll be 40 cents for the hem." But she felt the shift. She had been living in Ash Hollow long enough to understand how these changes moved through a community. Slowly at first, like weather coming from a long way off, and then all at once. People who had looked at her with pity began to look at her with something more pointed. She overheard a woman say outside the dry goods store that some women forget themselves when a man pays them any attention at all. And though she didn't hear her own name, she didn't need to. The women who had been kindest to her in her widowhood were now the first to look away when she walked past, and she understood that her grief had made her acceptable to them, and her potential recovery was making her something else. The men were different. 2 of them, friends of Silas Crow's, not his men but cut from similar cloth, came into the shop on a Friday afternoon and made comments about the price of her goods that were designed to be about more than the price of her goods. She handled it the way she always handled it, with ice-cold pleasantry that gave them nothing to grab onto, and they left unsatisfied. But the frequency was increasing, and she knew it. What she didn't know was that Brennan Cade had his own complications. She found out from Ed Holt, not because Ed was a gossip, he wasn't particularly, but because a man had come through on a Wednesday, headed east, who had recognized Brennan at the livery and said something to Ed at the store, and Ed had told her the next morning with the careful expression of a person who thinks information might be important, but isn't certain in what direction. "Fella said he knew Cade from the racing circuit," Ed said. "Down south. Said there was some kind of accident." Mara continued restocking her shelves. "What kind of accident?" "Horse race. The long-distance kind, where they ride relay." Ed picked up a glass jar and turned it over unnecessarily. "Said a rider got badly hurt. Threw from a horse. Some people said it was Cade's fault, that his horse got too close on a turn and the other horse spooked." She stopped restocking. "Was it?" "The fella didn't know for certain. He said Cade left the circuit after, and nobody knew where he went." She thought about the quality in Brennan's eyes that she had recognized from the first night. She thought about, "I had somewhere I was going. It turned out to be somewhere I didn't need to be after all." "You going to say something to him?" Ed asked. "It's his story to tell," she said. Ed nodded slowly. "That's a kind way to see it." "It's the only way I know," she said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. Yet. That evening she was alone in the shop when she heard it. A rock, thrown hard, striking her window. She crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled the curtain aside. The street was dark enough, and whoever had thrown it was gone. The window held good thick glass. Thomas had always insisted on good glass. But there was a mark on it, a long white scratch in the surface where the rock had struck. She stood there for a moment, holding the curtain, and looked out at the dark street. Then she went back to her table and picked up her hemming and kept working. The lamp in the window kept burning. She would not be the one to extinguish it. She had made herself that promise a long time ago, and she intended to keep it. The scratch on the window glass was still there in the morning, catching the early light at a particular angle that made it look worse than it was. Mara had examined it once by daylight, decided it hadn't gone all the way through, and made herself stop looking at it. Attention was a kind of feeding, she had found. Some things grew when you watched them too closely. She opened the shop at the usual time. She served her usual customers. She smiled the way she had learned to smile, and genuinely enough that nobody felt the effort behind it. And she took in 3 new alterations and sold a quarter-yard of brown wool and 2 papers of pins, and by noon the shop felt like what it always was, a place she had built from scratch and intended to keep. Brennan came in around 10 with his coffee from May's boarding house, which he had apparently taken to carrying across the street in the chipped tin cup that May allowed her regulars to borrow. He set it on the corner of the counter where it wouldn't be in her way and looked at the window. "When did that happen?" he said. "Last night, after dark." He was quiet for a moment, studying the scratch. "You didn't come get me." "There was nothing to come get you for. Whoever threw it was already gone." "Still." He turned away from the window, and there was something in his posture that she recognized as controlled. Not calm exactly, but a person who had decided what to do with an emotion that had arrived uninvited. "Crow." "I don't know that." "Who else?" She didn't have an answer for that, which was itself an answer. She went back to her cutting table and picked up the shears she'd been using before he came in. "It's one rock," she said. "It didn't break anything." "That's not the point." "I know what the point is," she said evenly, "but I'm not going to pack up my shop and close my window because someone threw a rock at it in the dark. That's exactly what they'd want." He looked at her. "You've done this before," he said. "This carrying on." 3 years of practice," she said, and went back to her cutting. He stayed for another hour, drinking his borrowed coffee and reading a 2-week-old newspaper that lived on the counter for customers who wanted it, and she worked, and it was the same comfortable arrangement they had fallen into across the past several days without ever discussing it. She had noticed that she worked better with him in the room, not because he helped, but because his presence had the quality of ballast. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't make noise. He just sat there being another human being, which was a smaller and more useful thing than most people understood. The gossip was worse this week than last, which she had expected. Small towns ran on patterns, and the pattern here was predictable. A new development would generate murmuring for a few days, then it would either fade or accelerate depending on what happened next. The rock through the window, if it became known, and in Ash Hollow most things became known, would accelerate it. She knew that. She was choosing, with full information, to not let it change what she did. What she hadn't been prepared for was Elsie Rowan. Elsie came into the shop on a Thursday, early, before most of Ash Hollow had shaken itself awake. She was 22 years old, slight and dark-haired, and she had been married to Roy Rowan for 14 months, in a way that had visibly diminished her since the wedding. She had been a lively girl before. Mara remembered her that way, at the social events that Mara attended out of necessity rather than desire, bright-eyed and quick to laugh. The Elsie who came into the shop on Thursday moved differently. She moved like a person who had learned to make herself small. She came in on the pretense of mending, which was transparent enough that Mara didn't examine it too carefully. She put the shirt, Roy's presumably, a big man's shirt with a loose button, on the counter, and then didn't leave. Just stood there looking at the fabric bolts with the specific unfocused attention of a person who is not looking at anything at all. Mara finished the stitch she was working on. "You want some water? I've got coffee if you'd rather." "Water's fine," Elsie said in a voice that had gone quiet in the wrong direction. Not peaceful, but flattened. Mara got the water and came around the counter, and they sat in the 2 chairs she kept near the window for customers who needed to wait. The morning light was soft through the glass, still cool, and the street outside was mostly empty. Elsie drank the water and looked at her hands. "He threw a pot," she said eventually. "It didn't hit me. He's careful about that, about where things land." Mara said nothing. She had learned when to speak and when to let a silence stand open. "He says I'm getting above myself," Elsie said. "I told him I wanted to visit my sister in Caldwell for a week. That's all I said." She turned the empty cup in her hands. "He said a woman with a decent husband has no reason to go visiting, that I was looking for reasons to embarrass him. Are you safe right now?" Elsie looked up. "He doesn't hit me." "That's not what I asked." Elsie held the empty cup a moment longer. Then she set it down on her knee. "I don't know," she said, and it sounded like it cost her something to say the true thing. Some days I feel like I'm watching myself from outside, like it's not me doing any of this. It's just some woman Roy married who does what Roy wants, and the person I was before is just somewhere else. Mara knew that particular feeling, though she had come to it differently. The 2 years after Thomas and Clara had done something similar, hollowed out a space between who she had been and who she was left being, and she had spent a long time trying to figure out whether those two things could be joined back up again. She thought they could, mostly, but it took work that nobody else could do for you. You haven't done anything wrong, Mara said. Wanting to visit your sister is not a wrong thing to want. He says, I know what he says. She said it carefully without heat. I'm telling you what's true. Elsie was quiet for a long moment. People say things about you, she said finally. I don't mean it as an insult. I mean, I hear what they say, and I know it's not. I know they're not being kind. But you don't seem like it touches you. It touches me, Mara said. I just don't let them see it. Those are different things. How? Mara thought about it honestly. You decide what you owe them, she said. They're going to say whatever they're going to say. You can't stop that, but you get to decide whether they get to watch it land. Elsie considered that with the careful attention of a person filing something away for later use, when she might need it. Roy knows Silas Crow, she said after a moment. They've done business. He mentioned your name last week, Crow did, at a supper at the Harkins place. Said something about... She stopped, smoothed her skirt. He said you were getting ideas above your situation. Did he say what ideas specifically? No, but something in her face said that wasn't entirely true. Mara let it go. You come by any time you need to, she said. The shop's open. You don't need a reason. Elsie nodded, and the nod was small and careful, the way everything about her had become small and careful, and Mara watched her walk out the door and felt the particular helplessness of seeing someone drowning slowly and not being able to wade in far enough to reach them. Well, she told Brennan about it that evening, not intending to tell anyone but finding that the conversation with Elsie had settled somewhere in her chest and needed moving. They were sitting on the bench outside the back of her shop, a bench Thomas had built along the side wall, facing the small yard that Mara had put a kitchen garden in and which now grew more weeds than anything else. And the evening was mild enough that being outside was pleasant, and she found herself talking before she had entirely decided to. The hard part isn't the cruelty, she said. The hard part is watching someone accept it like it's the natural order, like they've decided they deserve it. Some people get there, Brennan said. He was turning a small stone over in his fingers, which she had come to recognize as a habit he had when he was listening carefully. It happens gradually. You get enough of a message repeated at you long enough. Eventually, some part of you starts to believe it. Did that happen to you? He was quiet. You don't have to answer that, she said. No, it's... He set the stone down. There was an accident. I was racing, long-distance relay. 2.5 years ago now. My horse clipped another rider on a bad turn. The rider went down. His horse went down. He was hurt badly. Back injury, they said, might not walk right again. He said it in the tone of someone who has rehearsed a telling until they can get through it without breaking, but the rehearsal showed. People said I cut the turn too close, that I knew the risk, and I took it anyway because I was in the lead and didn't want to lose it. Was that true? The turn was too close, he said. Whether I did it on purpose, I honestly don't. I've gone over it so many times I can't trust my own memory anymore. I know I wanted to win. I know I'd taken risks before. I can't say for certain what was happening in my head on that exact turn. He looked at his hands. I left the circuit after. I couldn't... He stopped, started again differently. Being the man who crippled another rider, every track, every town, I couldn't carry that in front of people. So you started carrying it alone instead. He looked at her sideways. Is that what I did? Seems like. He was quiet again. His name was Darnell Cook, he said. I don't know where he is. I don't know if he walked again. I've thought about trying to find out, and then I think... He stopped. I don't know what I think. Mara understood the particular paralysis of an apology you couldn't bring yourself to deliver because you were afraid of what the delivering would cost. You'll know when you're ready, she said. What if I'm never ready? Then you'll carry it until you are. She said it without softness because it was true, and softening it would have been condescending. I carried things for a long time. I still do. It doesn't kill you. It changes your shape, but it doesn't kill you. He looked at her with the same direct, assessing look he'd had since the first night. The look that she had come to understand was simply how he saw things. Straight on, without wanting them to be different than they were. "You're a remarkable woman," he said, plainly, like it was a statement of observable fact. She felt warmth rise in her face and was grateful for the dimming evening light. "I'm a woman who's had to figure some things out," she said. "It's not remarkable. It's just what happens when you don't have a choice." "Maybe that's what remarkable is," he said. She didn't answer that, but she didn't dismiss it either, and they sat on the bench until the light went all the way down and the fireflies came up from the grass in the yard. The following Monday, she found a note. It had been slipped under the shop door some time before she opened. A folded piece of paper, no envelope, her name written on the outside in handwriting she didn't recognize. She stood at the front door with the morning sun already warm at her back and unfolded it. "You think you're better than people know. Ask your cowboy friend what he did to Darnell Cook. Some of us know who he is. You bring any more trouble to this town and you'll wish you hadn't." She read it twice, folded it back up, put it in the drawer under her cutting table, the one where she kept the box of Thomas's letters, and went about opening the shop. When Brennan came in at 10, she didn't say anything about it. She had made her decision about the note on the walk from the door to the cutting table, which was that whoever had written it wanted her to be frightened, and she had a limited amount of fear to spend, and she intended to spend it carefully. But she watched his face when he came in, the familiar careful composure, and she thought about what he'd said the night before. "I've gone over it so many times I can't trust my own memory anymore." And she felt the note burning in the drawer like it had its own particular heat. "Something happened," he said, looking at her. "I'm fine." "Mara." "I said I'm fine." He sat down with his coffee and said nothing else, and she was grateful for that too, for a man who knew when to stop pushing. The note was not the worst thing that week. The worst thing was what happened on Wednesday. She was coming back from the post office in the late afternoon, walking the 2 blocks back to the shop in the long, low light, when she passed 3 women she knew standing outside the milliner's. 2 of them, Sarah Greer and a woman called Patrice Holt, Ed's sister-in-law, looked up and then looked at each other in that quick, loaded way, and the third, old Helen Marsh, who had been a friend to Mara in the months after Thomas died, said nothing. But the looking away was so deliberate, it was louder than anything she could have said. Mara kept walking. She made her face do the thing it did, the pleasant steadiness that gave nothing away. And she walked the 2 blocks back to her shop and locked the door behind her and sat at her cutting table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. They had decided. The town had done its accounting and come up with a verdict. And the verdict was that Mara Ellsworth had moved past acceptable grief into something they didn't have a comfortable name for, and the man she was seeing too much of had a dark history, and her size and her widowhood had always made her aspirations suspect, and she had gotten above herself. She sat there for a while with her hands on the table. Then she got up and lit the lamp in the window. Silas Crow came in on Friday, as he had promised, to collect his buttons. He came alone this time, which was almost more threatening than coming with his men, because alone he had a different quality, more contained, more deliberate, with none of the performance he put on for an audience. He stood at the counter while she counted out his 40 buttons and wrapped them in paper, and he watched her with those small pale eyes in a way that made her want to put the counter between them, which it already was, which helped. "Heard you've had some trouble," he said. "Nothing I can't manage," she said. "A window, a note, I heard." He said I heard in the way of a man sharing information that has passed through at least 2 pairs of hands, establishing plausible distance. Ash Hollow's generally a peaceful town. "It has been," she agreed. "People do get stirred up sometimes," he said, "when things change, when the usual order gets unsettled." She tied the paper parcel and set it on the counter. "Your buttons, Mr. Crow." He picked them up. Didn't leave. "That cowboy's still here," he said. "He's still here," she confirmed. "He planning to stay?" "You'd have to ask him." Something moved behind his eyes, a brief tightening, quickly controlled. "I know who he is," Silas said. Brennan Cade. I made some inquiries." He let that sit for a moment, the way a man sets a trap and then waits to see if the animal steps into it. "He's got a reputation." "Most people do," she said. "Depends who you ask." The man he put in the dirt at Fenmore has been in a bad way ever since. I understood he's still alive, she said, which was not quite deflection and not quite defense. It was the truth, as far as she knew it, offered plainly. Silas studied her. You're either foolish, he said, or you think being bold makes you smart. I think being accurate makes me accurate, she said. Is there anything else you need today? The pause that followed was long enough to be a statement in itself. Then Silas Crow picked up his parcel of buttons and walked out, and the bell above the door swung and settled, and the shop was quiet. Mara put both hands on the counter and held still until she was sure her breathing had evened out. She was not frightened. That was the thing she needed to be clear on, even here, alone in the shop with the afternoon going gray outside. She was not frightened of Silas Crow. She was wary of him, which was a different and more useful thing. Wary meant she was paying attention. Wary meant she hadn't stopped calculating. And what she was calculating, standing at the counter with her hands pressed to the wood, was that a man who came in to talk about trouble and mention what he knew and ask questions he didn't need the answers to was not a man who was trying to warn her. He was a man who was deciding something. She went to the drawer under the cutting table and took out the note and read it again. The handwriting was not Silas's, but that was not what mattered. What mattered was the phrase she had not been able to stop returning to in the days since she'd read it the first time. Ask your cowboy friend what he did to Darnell Cook. He already knew about Brennan, had known before this week, before the questions at the counter. He had made inquiries, he said, but he said it in the past tense, the comfortable past tense, of someone who had already been sitting on that information and was now deciding how to use it. She folded the note back up and put it in her pocket this time. That evening, when Brennan came by after his work at the livery, she was still at the shop, and she told him about Silas's visit and about the note, and she put it on the cutting table between them without drama or setup, just laid it flat. He read it. His face didn't change much, but she had been watching his face long enough now to read the small things, the jaw, the stillness in his eyes. He's been gathering information, Brennan said. Before any of this started, Mara said. The rocks, the note. Those aren't him losing his temper. Those are him applying pressure. Brennan set the note down. Why? That I don't know yet. He looked at the note for another moment. Whatever it is, he said, it's not about me. And it's not really about you being, about what you look like or who you're talking to. It's about the property, she said, because she had been turning it over since Silas left, and it was the only explanation that held the right weight. Thomas's land, my land now. Brennan looked up at her. He's a cattle buyer, she said. He moves things across this territory. If there was a freight route coming through, he'd want the land along it early, Brennan finished. The lamp in the window cast its steady light across the cutting table, across the note, across Brennan's hands. He's been trying to make me small enough to leave, she said. It was a cold thing to say, coldly, but it was true. The pity, the whispers, making sure nobody in town stands close enough to me that his pressure might cost them something. If he can make me isolated enough, frightened enough, you'd sell and go somewhere else. Or he'd find another way to take it. She put the note in the drawer again under Thomas's letters where it belonged. I won't do it. I know you won't, he said, without a trace of surprise. She looked at him across the cutting table, this man she had known less than 2 weeks, who had arrived with a broken saddle strap and stayed without planning to, who sat in her kitchen without asking for anything and stood in her doorway without making anything into a performance. And she thought about what it meant to be seen by another person, not pitied, not patronized, not reduced to a size they found comfortable, just seen. I'm glad you're still here, she said, which was more than she had intended to say. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not going anywhere, he said. And outside, the spring night settled over Ash Hollow, and the lamp in the window kept burning, and somewhere across town, Silas Crow was making decisions that neither of them could entirely see yet. But the shape of them was beginning to come clear, and Mara had been surviving the shapes of things long enough to know that seeing them coming was already half the battle. The understanding that Silas Crow was after the land did not make Mara feel better exactly. It made her feel differently. Less like a woman being eroded by casual cruelty, and more like a woman standing in the path of something with specific intentions. There was a strange, dark usefulness to that. Knowing the shape of the danger meant she could stop bracing for things that weren't coming and start paying attention to the things that were. She said nothing to anyone about her theory for the first 3 days. She kept it to herself the way she kept most things, working it over in the mornings while she opened the shop, examining it from different angles, looking for the places where it didn't hold up. It kept holding up. The land ran north of town in a rough rectangle, 40 acres of solid ground with good drainage, and a creek that didn't run dry in summer. Thomas had chosen it carefully, back when choosing carefully still felt like the beginning of something, rather than the careful management of what remained. He hadn't farmed it. They'd talked about it, planned it in the vague way of people who believe they have more time than they do. And since his death, Mara had kept the taxes paid and the boundary markers clear and otherwise left it alone. She had not thought of it as particularly valuable. She had thought of it as Thomas's land, and therefore hers, and therefore not a thing to be sold or traded away simply because continuing to own it was complicated. She had not thought about freight routes. Brennan had. He came back from the assay office on a Thursday morning. She hadn't known he'd gone there, and she didn't ask why immediately. And he sat down across from her cutting table with a piece of paper he'd sketched something on. "Talk to me about the eastern boundary," he said. She looked at the sketch. It was a rough map, drawn in the precise, economical lines of a man who understood land and distances. "Why?" "Because there are 3 other pieces of property that share that approach," he said. "And 2 of the 3 have already changed hands in the last 18 months. He put his finger on the paper. "Widows, both of them. One sold, one just disappeared from the record, which is a different thing." She looked at the names he'd written. She knew one of them, a woman named Ruth Hasley, who had left Ash Hollow about a year ago, quietly, with a forwarding address nobody seemed to have. "Ruth Hasley didn't sell willingly," Mara said. "I would have known." "Would you?" She thought about it honestly. "Maybe not," she admitted. She kept to herself. "The county land records are a mess," he said. "There's a lot of things in there that should be cleaner than they are. Transactions without proper witnesses. Signatures that look—" He stopped. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not saying I know what any of it means, but it's worth talking to someone who is. There's no lawyer in Ash Hollow. There's one in Caldwell." She looked at him. Caldwell was 40 miles east, a larger town with a courthouse and a telegraph office and, apparently, a lawyer. "You've been looking into this," she said. "I've been looking into a few things," he said without apology. She should have felt something about that. Some instinct about a person investigating her business without asking. She didn't particularly, which was its own kind of information about where they stood. "When were you thinking about going to Caldwell?" "That depends on whether you want to come." "I can't close the shop for 2 days." "One day," he said. "Early start, hard ride back." She thought about it. She thought about Ruth Hasley's name on a land record that didn't look right, and about Silas's small pale eyes, and about the scratch on her window glass. "Let me see if Dottie Aldrin can watch the shop," she said. But they didn't get to Caldwell that week. On Saturday night, at a few minutes past midnight, someone set fire to the sewing shop. She smelled it first, in her sleep, the particular acrid smell that is not wood smoke but something else, something hotter and more deliberate. And she was up and through the hallway before she was fully awake, feet bare on the cold floor, the smell thickening as she got closer to the shop door. She opened the connecting door and the heat hit her face immediately. The front left corner of the shop was burning. The fabric bolts she registered, the ones stacked near the window, the dry goods she'd ordered 2 weeks ago and hadn't yet shelved properly. The window itself was already gone. The fire had started outside and come in. She did not freeze. She had always thought, in a distant, untested way, that she might freeze in a crisis, but she didn't. Her body moved on its own, back to the kitchen for the water bucket she kept beside the stove, filled and heavy, and she threw it at the base of the near flames and went back for the wash basin and threw that too. And she was on her 3rd trip when she heard shouting from the street, and the front door came open and Brennan was there. She didn't ask later how he had known. He'd been sleeping light, he said. He'd been sleeping light for the past week without saying so to her because he had been expecting something. He took the bucket from her and went directly at the remaining fire with the focused efficiency of a man who had made fast decisions before. And she went back to the kitchen for more water, and they worked in a grim relay until the fire was out, or mostly out. And by then 2 other men from the street, Jim Carver and a young man called Pete something from the feed store had come in with their own buckets, and the corner was black and charred and smoking, but the building was standing. Mara stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the shop and looked at what was left of her front corner. Half the fabric bolts were destroyed. The window frame was gone. The floor was black for about 6 feet in every direction from the origin point. The smell was going to be in everything for weeks. She was shaking. She noticed this at a distance, the way you notice weather outside a window. The shaking was happening to her body, but she was observing it from somewhere slightly removed. She put her hand on the doorframe to steady herself and made herself assess the damage in order, methodically, the way Thomas used to when something went wrong. The structural wall was intact. The ceiling was not compromised. The cutting table was untouched. The goods in the back shelves were untouched. The lamp in the window was gone with the window frame. Brennan came back through the shop and stopped when he saw her face. He crossed to where she was standing and put his hands on her shoulders, both of them, steady and careful, and looked at her. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. "I'm all right." She was still shaking. "My fabric." "I know. The Deacon order. I had Mrs. Deacon's wedding fabric in the—" She stopped. She looked past him at the corner. The shelving where she'd set aside Mrs. Deacon's fabric was on the undamaged side of the room. She could see the brown paper parcel sitting there untouched, which was such an improbable small mercy that she felt something crack slightly in her chest and had to work to close it up again quickly. "It's there," Brennan said, following her look. "It's fine." Jim Carver was standing in what was left of the window frame, looking out at the street. "Somebody threw something through the glass first," he said. "You can see it. Bottle, looked like, with something burning." "An incendiary," Pete said, with the authority of someone who had served in some capacity that involved knowing that word. "Call it what it is," Jim said. "Somebody tried to burn you out." He said it to Mara, directly, without dressing it up, and she appreciated that more than she could say. "Yes," she said. "They did." "You know who?" She looked at him. She knew what answering that question directly would cost her at this hour, with no evidence but her own assessment and a badly drawn map in a pocket. "I have some ideas," she said. "Nothing I can prove tonight." Jim nodded slowly. He was a fair man, Jim Carver, steadier than most. "I'll stay until sunup," he said, "case they try again." "I appreciate it," she said. Brennan was still behind her. She could feel him at her back, not hovering, just there, a solid presence. And she thought, this is what it is to have someone in your corner. Not someone who fixes things for you, just someone who shows up and does the next necessary thing. She didn't go to sleep again that night. After Jim and Pete were settled in the street, and Brennan had done a full walk around the outside of the building and come back to say that the origin point was a broken window on the side wall, which meant someone had come down the alley, she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought. Brennan sat across from her and did not try to tell her what to think. "He wanted to scare me enough to leave," she said eventually. "Or he expected the fire to do more than it did. Maybe." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He couldn't have known I'd wake up when I did. If I'd slept another half hour—" She didn't finish that. "He might have been willing to risk more than a scare." The words sat there between them. Brennan didn't soften it or argue with it. "We go to Caldwell Monday," he said. "Yes," she said. She went to the shop window the next morning, in the early gray light before anyone was properly up, and she stood in the burned-out frame where the glass had been and looked out at the empty street. The lamp was gone. The frame it had sat in was a black ruin. She went to the back shelf and found the spare lamp she kept for the occasional evening when a customer needed to see fabric colors in better light, a smaller thing, plain and functional, and she brought it to what was left of the front of the shop, and she set it in the opening where the window had been, in the morning light where everyone walking down the main street of Ash Hollow could see it, and she lit it. It was a ridiculous thing to do in the daylight. The flame was barely visible in the morning sun. She knew that. She lit it anyway. Brennan heard her go out to the shop. He was on the kitchen bench with his coffee, close enough that he heard her moving. And when he came to the connecting door and saw what she'd done, he stood there for a moment looking at the small lit lamp in the ruined window frame. And he didn't say anything, and she was glad of that. What she didn't know was that 3 people walking down the street that morning saw it too, and stopped, and looked, and carried what they'd seen with them through the rest of the day. One of them was Elsie Rowan. Elsie had been up early on account of Roy sleeping badly, and she'd come out for the baker's bread while the morning was still cool, and she came past the shop and stopped dead at the sight of the burned window. And then she saw the lamp, small and burning, set right there in the opening. She stood on the boardwalk for a long moment. Then she kept walking, but the thing in her face had changed slightly, the way a person's face changes when they've seen something they don't have a name for yet, but intend to remember. The second person was Ed Holt, who opened his store early and had seen the fire from his upstairs window the previous night but had not come down. He told himself later it was because by the time he'd gotten his trousers on, the fire looked to be under control, which was true, and not the whole truth. Ed was a decent man who had done what decent men in small towns had always done in the face of someone else's trouble, which was calculate the cost to himself and find it more significant than the cost to the other person. He was not proud of this calculation, and looking at the lamp in the window, he felt its specific weight again and found himself disliking the feeling. The third person was a man named Bernard Wick, who was Ash Hollow's notary, and who passed the shop on his way to the post office, and who looked at the burned window frame and the burning lamp inside it, and kept his eyes forward and walked faster, and whose manner, if anyone had been paying attention, was not the manner of a man encountering surprising news, but of a man encountering consequences he had been vaguely expecting. Mara did not see Wick. She was in the back of the shop assessing the inventory, making the list of what was lost, beginning the necessary practical work of recovery. But Brennan was outside checking the side wall, and he saw Wick, and he remembered the face. So, the Sunday after the fire, Ash Hollow's Main Street had the particular quality it sometimes got on the heels of an event, that heightened alertness, people moving slightly more carefully, conversations happening in groups of 3 and 4 outside the church hall and outside the barber's, the social machinery of a small town processing something it hadn't decided yet how to categorize. Mara opened the shop. There was boarding over the window now. Jim Carver had come back with planks and nails Saturday morning without being asked. And the interior still smelled of smoke, a smell she was going to be living with for some time. But the space was functional and the cutting table was untouched, and she had work to do. The first customer through the door was May Fraser, who had been present at the beginning and who came in now with the particular directness of a woman who had been thinking about something long enough that she was ready to say it. "I should have said something sooner," May said, without preamble, "about Silas Crow and the way he talks about you." "You're saying it now," Mara said. "I heard something," May said. She sat down in the customer's chair and held her bag in her lap and looked at Mara squarely. "About 2 years ago, Silas and Bernard Wick had a private meeting at my place. I rent out my parlor sometimes for business meetings. You know that. I didn't hear the whole thing, but I heard enough to know they were talking about land, not cattle. Land." "What land?" "Yours, specifically." May's mouth compressed briefly. "He said something about the eastern parcel. Said it would be worth 10 times what it was when the territory rail spur went through, and that the woman who owned it wouldn't be in a position to hold on to it much longer." She paused. "Those were the words he used. In a position." Mara held very still. "May, you're telling me he said this 2 years ago?" "I know." May's voice did not change, but the thing behind it did. "I know what that says about me. I've thought about it. I thought it wasn't my business, and I thought he was probably wrong about the rail spur, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought you'd be all right. And then one thing and another, and I told myself it was nothing, and then somebody put fire to your window, and I couldn't tell myself that anymore." Mara looked at her for a long moment. She had known May for 3 years. May had been one of the first people to bring her food after Thomas died, and one of the first people to start looking away when Brennan appeared. She was a complicated woman, like most people were complicated, and Mara was not inclined toward easy judgments about what complexity cost people. "I need you to be willing to say that to the lawyer in Caldwell," Mara said. "What you just told me." May straightened. "I expected you'd say that. Are you willing?" A pause that lasted long enough to be real, to be the actual weight of the decision. "Yes," May said. "I'm willing." "What?" Brennan told her about Bernard Wick that afternoon and what he'd seen in the notary's face when Wick passed the shop. "A notary can forge documents," Mara said. She was rearranging the surviving fabric bolts to fill the gaps left by the ones destroyed in the fire. doing it with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory. That's who you'd need, not a lawyer, those leave records. A notary. Deed transfers, Brennan said. Backdated, signed under... She stopped. Her hands went still on the fabric. There's a deed in the county record already, she said. I'd bet on it. Filed sometime in the last 2 years, maybe right after Thomas died, when I had less capacity to look at things closely. If there's a record, then the land might already not be mine on paper. She said it evenly, because she needed to hear it evenly, needed to understand the full dimension of it before she could think about what to do with it. Which is why he's been applying pressure, rather than just taking it. He needs me gone, or scared enough, before anyone looks too closely. Brennan was leaning against the back shelving with his arms crossed, watching her. The lawyer in Caldwell can pull county records, he said. I know. We go tomorrow. We go tomorrow, she agreed. She went back to her fabric, her hands moving again. The smoke smell was already starting to feel like part of the shop, part of its new history. She thought about Thomas choosing this building, this land, this town, with that young man's confidence and forward motion, and she thought about what he would make of what was happening to his property, the thing he had worked to leave her with. She knew what he would make of it. He would be furious in his quiet, undramatic way, the way he got furious when things were fundamentally unfair, and then he would set about doing something about it. She had married a man worth learning from. She had learned. That evening, Brennan went to the telegraph office. He did not tell her he was going, and when he came back, he sat at her kitchen table for a while without saying anything, with the expression of a man who has done something that cost him and is not yet sure if it was right. I sent a telegram, he said eventually. She waited. To a man I know in Fenmore, a man who knows people in the racing circuit. He put his hands flat on the table. I asked him to find out what happened to Darnell Cook. She looked at him. What made you decide to do that now? You lit the lamp this morning, he said, in a burned-out window, in broad daylight. She did not entirely follow the logic, but she understood the feeling behind it, which was something about a person watching another person refuse to go dark and finding in that refusal a kind of permission they needed for themselves. He might not be findable, she said. He might not. He held her gaze. But if I'm going to stand here and tell Silas Crow and Bernard Wick and anyone else in this town who's watching that the truth matters and people deserve to have it, I can't keep running from the piece of truth I own. She said nothing for a moment. Silas tried to use it against you, she said. What you told me about the accident. I know. He was going to use it publicly, to discredit you, so that anything you said in my defense would come back to that. I know that too. A beat. That's not why I sent the telegram, or not only why. She believed him. What will you do if you find out he's still badly hurt? He thought about it. I'll ask him what he needs, he said, and if I can give it, I will. It was not a complicated answer, but it was an honest one, and she thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who could sit with their worst mistake, not run from it, not construct stories around it that made it less, but just hold it as what it was and figure out what the next right thing to do about it looked like. She had tried to be that kind of person. She had not always managed it. She was still trying. I think that's right, she said. He nodded. She could see the tension in him that the telegram had cost, the specific vulnerability of a person who has extended themselves towards something they cannot control the outcome of. And she didn't try to take it away because some weights were not meant to be taken away, only shared. Caldwell tomorrow, she said. Caldwell tomorrow, he agreed. She got up to clear the supper things, and he helped her without being asked, the same way he always did. And outside the boarded window, the night came down over Ash Hollow, and the spare lamp still sat in the front of the shop where she'd put it that morning, burning small and steady against the dark. She had known, when she lit it, that it would draw attention, that some of that attention would be hostile, that Silas Crow would hear about it and draw his own conclusions, and that those conclusions would push him further, toward something more direct, more decisive. She had known that. She had lit it anyway, because the alternative was letting them measure out her life for her, decide when her grief was acceptable and when it had gone on too long, decide what she was allowed to want and who she was allowed to let into her kitchen and what a woman built like her deserved to expect from the years she had left. and she had never been willing to let other people make those determinations. Not really, not even in the worst of the past 3 years. She had bent. She had gone quiet sometimes. She had smiled at men who deserved nothing, and she had absorbed cruelties that should have been confronted. But she had kept the lamp burning. And now, with a burned window frame and a man at her kitchen table who had just sent a telegram that scared him, and a trip to Caldwell in the morning, and the knowledge that Silas Crow was not done with her yet, she found that she was not afraid. She was clear. She was absolutely clear, the way the air gets after a hard rain, sharp and clean and full of detail. She dried the last dish and hung the towel on the rack and said goodnight to Brennan, and she went to her bedroom and she slept without dreaming. And in the front of the shop, the small lamp burned on in the boarded window until it ran out of oil sometime in the small hours. And by then, Ash Hollow had already started, in ways it didn't entirely understand yet, to change its mind about what it was looking at when it looked at Mara Ellsworth. They left for Caldwell before sunup. Mara had packed what she needed the night before. The land deed Thomas had kept in the tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom, the only copy she'd ever known about, along with the tax receipts going back 7 years and the original survey document from when they'd first acquired the property. She had not looked at these papers in over 2 years. Taking them out of the tin box the previous evening, she'd found a folded note in Thomas's handwriting tucked behind the survey. Just a list of measurements, property line distances, written in the precise hand he'd always had. And she'd stood there in the bedroom holding it for longer than she'd intended before folding it back where she found it. She brought everything. The ride to Caldwell was 40 miles of mostly flat road, broken by 2 creek crossings and a long stretch through scrub country where the wind came sideways and the sun was cold and high. They rode mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the way their silences had become comfortable. Not empty, but considered, 2 people who didn't feel the need to fill space. About 12 miles out, Brennan said, "I got a reply on the telegram." She looked at him. "Darnell Cook," he said. "My contact found him. He kept his eyes on the road. He's in a town called Marfa, running a small horse operation. Quarter horses, mostly." A pause. "He walks with a limp," my contact said, "but he walks." She let that sit for a moment. That's good news." "Yeah." His voice was careful, the way a person's voice gets when they're holding something they're not quite sure how to handle. My contact passed along his address. Said Cook had heard my name mentioned and didn't express any particular bitterness. Those were his words. Didn't express any particular bitterness. "That's different from forgiveness," Mara said. "I know it is," Brennan said, "but it's something." She thought about what it meant to learn that the worst thing you'd done hadn't destroyed someone entirely. The complicated relief of it, the way it didn't actually remove the weight but changed its character slightly, made it something you could maybe pick up and examine rather than something that just pressed down from above. She thought Brennan was finding his way toward that examination, slowly, the way you move toward a fire when you've been cold a long time and aren't sure yet how close you can stand. "Are you going to write to him?" she asked. "I think I have to," he said. "Not today, but I think I have to." She nodded. They rode the rest of the way to Caldwell with that between them, not as a weight, but as something decided, which is a different thing entirely. The lawyer in Caldwell was a woman named Harriet Voss, which Mara had not expected, and which made her feel, obscurely, better about the whole endeavor. Harriet Voss was 50 or thereabouts, with a broad face and direct manner, and an office above the hardware store that smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular dryness of rooms where serious work gets done. She listened to everything Mara said without interrupting, and then she listened to Brennan's account of the land records he'd pulled from the assay office, and when they were done she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the papers spread across her desk. "How long ago did your husband die?" she said to Mara. 3 years? "And you haven't had anyone look at your deed or the county record since then?" "I kept the taxes paid," Mara said. "I assumed that meant the record was clean." Harriet made a sound that was not quite a sigh. "Paying taxes on a property doesn't confirm title," she said. "It confirms you've been paying taxes." She picked up the survey document and examined it. "You said there were 2 other properties on the same eastern approach that had transferred ownership recently." "Both widows," Brennan said. "One sold quickly. One I can't find any record of a proper transaction." What was the notary's name on the Ash Hollow records?
Wick, Mara said.
Bernard Wick. Harriet wrote it down.
I know of him, she said, and the know of carried something in it that was not complimentary.
He's certified through the county office, but there have been questions about his work going back 4 or 5 years. Nothing that ever went to formal inquiry.
She set her pen down.
I need to pull the county records myself. That's going to take me several days. I'll have to ride to the county seat at Fletcher, not Caldwell. The primary land records are held there. She looked at Mara directly. If what you're describing is accurate, if there's a fraudulent transfer already filed against your property, it's not an easy thing to undo. It can be done, but it requires proof of forgery, and that means finding the original forged documents, not just arguing that they look wrong. What kind of proof would be enough? Brennan said.
A witness, Harriet said.
Ideally someone who was present for the filing or knew about it beforehand. Someone who can speak to what Crow intended and when he intended it. She looked at Mara. You mentioned a woman, May Fraser, who heard a conversation 2 years ago.
She's willing to make a statement, Mara said.
That's a start, Harriet said. It's not sufficient on its own, but it's a start.
She gathered the papers into a neat stack and looked at them with the expression of someone sorting out a course of action. Leave me copies of what you've brought. I'll ride to Fletcher Wednesday and pull what I can find. I'll send word when I have something concrete.
What are we looking at in terms of time? Brennan asked.
2 weeks, maybe 3.
She looked at him with the frank assessment of someone who had been in rooms where men underestimated her enough times to be tired of it, but still patient with it. I know that feels long when you're looking at a man who just put fire to her property.
It does, Mara said, but I'm not going anywhere.
She said it plainly, without drama.
I'll be in Ash Hollow when you send word.
Harriet nodded, something in her face relaxing slightly.
Good, she said. A client who runs makes my job harder. Some.
On the ride back around the second creek crossing where the horses needed to slow and pick their way, Brennan said,
She's good.
She is, Mara agreed. Crow won't like it if he finds out you've talked to a lawyer.
He'll find out, she said.
Towns talk and roads talk worse. Someone in Caldwell will mention it, and it'll be in Ash Hollow before we are.
Does that worry you?
She thought about it honestly.
It makes me careful, she said.
He's already shown what he'll do when he feels like things are slipping. The fire wasn't a warning. That was a man who was running out of patience with the slow method.
Brennan looked at her sideways.
You think he'll try something more direct?
I think he's going to try whatever he has left to try, she said.
And I think we need to be paying attention. They got back to Ash Hollow in the late afternoon, the light going orange and long across the main street, the familiar shapes of buildings casting familiar shadows. Mara had been gone barely 12 hours, and the town looked the same, which still managed to surprise her sometimes. How unchanged a place could look, while everything important about it was shifting beneath the surface. 3 things happened in the days that followed, and they happened in the order that mattered. The first was Elsie Rowan. She came to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon with no pretense of mending this time, and she sat in the customer's chair and looked at Mara with a directness she hadn't had the last time. Something in her face that had hardened slightly in the way that a person's face hardens when they have been practicing something.
Roy was at Silas Crow's last Thursday, she said. He came home. He'd been drinking, which he does when he's been with Crow, and he said things. About you. She steadied herself. He said Crow was going to make sure you understood your situation before the end of the month. Those were the exact words. Understood your situation. And he said something about papers that were already done and that you could make it easy or you could make it hard, but either way, it was already done. Mara held very still. Papers already done. That's what he said. Elsie, she leaned forward slightly. Can you tell that to a lawyer? Elsie pressed her lips together. If I do that, Roy will know. Yes, Mara said. She didn't soften it. He probably will. He'll be. Elsie stopped. She looked down at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. He'll be furious. I know. Mara looked at her steadily. I'm not going to tell you it won't have consequences for you. It will. I'm going to tell you that you have the right to tell the truth about what you heard, and that you can decide what to do with that right, however you need to. She paused.
I'm also going to tell you that there's a woman in Caldwell who's a lawyer, and that if you ever find yourself needing to talk to someone about your own situation, I will personally ride you there myself." Elsie looked up. Something moved through her face. "My situation," she said softly, as if testing whether it was permitted to call it that. "Your situation?" Mara said. Elsie was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'll make the statement," she said. "Tell me who to talk to." The second thing was Bernard Wick. Brennan had been watching him, carefully and without making it obvious, in the way of a man who had spent enough years reading people at a distance to do it without appearing to look. What he'd seen across the days since the fire was a notary behaving like a man whose sleep had gone wrong. The drawn face, the sharp startling at small sounds, the walks he took in the early morning that took him nowhere with the gait of someone working through a problem they can't put down. On the Thursday after Caldwell, Brennan found Wick at the far end of the livery, where Amos Pell kept the stalls that were currently empty, examining one of the fence posts with the focused attention of someone who needed to be seen doing something. "Mr. Wick," Brennan said. Wick turned. He was a small man, thin, with the kind of precise appearance, clean-shaven, neat collar, that people sometimes use as evidence of their trustworthiness and sometimes as a wall. He looked at Brennan with the expression of a man who had been expecting something and was now unsure if this was it. "Mr. Cade," he said. Brennan leaned against the opposite fence post and said nothing for a moment, which was a tactic he had learned a long time ago. Let the silence speak first and see what the other person does with it. Wick did what guilty people usually did. He talked. "I hear Mrs. Ellsworth had some trouble," he said. "The fire. Very unfortunate." "It was," Brennan said. "This town's generally peaceful." Wick was twisting the fence post slightly back and forth. "These things happen, though. Occasionally." "They do," Brennan agreed. "Less occasionally when someone's trying to move a property owner off land that's got value coming." Wick's hand stopped on the fence post. "I don't know what you mean," he said, and the words came out with the precise flatness of something rehearsed. "I think you do," Brennan said. He said it without aggression, without heat, in the same easy tone he'd used for the whole exchange. "I think you've known for a while that this was going somewhere you didn't fully agree to when it started. I think there's a difference between what you signed up for and what ended up in your shop window at midnight." Wick looked at him. The precision in his face was cracking slightly at the edges. "I want you to understand something," Brennan said. "A lawyer in Caldwell is pulling the county land records right now. What she finds, she's going to find it. The question of what happens next depends a lot on what she finds and who's already told the truth before she finds it." He pushed off from the fence post. "I'm not a lawman. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you how these things tend to go, in my experience, because I've seen them go badly for people who thought there was still a version of events where they came out of it untouched." He left Wick standing in the empty livery stall and walked back out into the morning. He didn't know if it would take. He had said what he could say. The rest depended on what kind of man Bernard Wick was under the neat collar, whether the thing that had gone wrong behind his eyes was conscience or simply fear, and whether either of those was going to be enough. When he told Mara about it that evening, she listened without interrupting. "He might go straight to Crow," she said. "He might. Which means Crow knows we're closer than he thought. Which means Crow does something," Brennan said. "Soon, before Harriet Voss sends word from Fletcher." Mara nodded. She had been waiting for this shape to arrive. "All right," she said. "Totab." The third thing was Silas Crow himself, and it happened on a Friday morning at the end of the second week. He came into the shop alone. No men, no performance, just himself and the contained quality he had when he was being deliberate about something. Mara was behind the counter. She had known this visit was coming, not from any specific information, but from the same instinct that tells you weather before the sky shows it. "Mara," he said. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I want to talk to you about your property." "All right," she said. He put an envelope on the counter. "There's an offer in there," he said. "Reasonable one. More than fair, considering." He let considering hang without attaching it to anything, which was itself a kind of threat. She didn't touch the envelope. "Considering what, Mr. Crow?" "Considering the state of the building," he said. "Considering your circumstances." My circumstances are that I own my property and I'm not selling it, she said. He looked at her steadily, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was not anger. It was closer to frustration, a man who had applied a series of calculated pressures in what he considered the correct order and was now confronting the fact that they hadn't worked. There's going to be a rail spur, he said, and it was the most direct he had ever been with her, which told her that his patience for the slow method was completely exhausted. Coming through the eastern approach in 2, maybe 3 years. The land along that route is going to be worth more than you can imagine from where you're standing right now. I've been planning around that for years. I know, she said. He blinked. I know about the rail spur, she said. I know about the land records at the county seat. I know about Bernard Wick, and I know about Ruth Hasley and the other woman whose property transferred in a way that doesn't look right. She said it calmly, the way you put facts on a table, so not to threaten, but to show what was already there. I have a lawyer in Caldwell who is at the county seat in Fletcher right now. The room was very quiet. The boarded window let in thin lines of light that cut across the floor between them. You have no proof of anything, he said, and his voice had gone low and deliberate in the way that had probably frightened a number of people in a number of rooms. Not yet, she said, but I have witnesses, and I have a lawyer who knows what she's looking for, and I have time. You have a building with a burned corner, he said, and a cowboy who's going to move on eventually, and a town full of people who've already decided what you are. She looked at him. Leave the envelope, she said. I'll let my lawyer look at it. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the shop, and the bell above the door made its small sound, and he was gone. She sat down. Her knees had been shaking behind the counter the entire time, a thing she was grateful he hadn't been able to see. She sat in the customer's chair and put her hands in her lap and breathed until the shaking stopped, and then she got up and went back to work. Pokok. Bernard Wick went to Harriet Voss's office in Caldwell the following Monday. He had not gone to Silas Crow first. Whether this was conscience or self-preservation or the specific fear of a man who had watched the walls close in from both directions and decided that the law was the less immediately dangerous option, Mara never entirely knew. What she knew was what Harriet Voss told her when the letter arrived 10 days later. Wick had filed an affidavit. In it, he described, with the careful specificity of a man with a good memory who had been living with something too long, the details of 2 fraudulent deed transfers that he had prepared at Silas Crow's direction. The first was dated 14 months after Thomas Ellsworth's death, a backdated transfer of Mara's 40 acres to a holding company that existed on paper only, controlled by Crow through a third party named in the affidavit. The second was the Hasley property, handled similarly, filed 8 months later. He described the meeting at May Fraser's boarding house where the plan had been discussed. He described the pressure applied to Ruth Hasley, who had been told, falsely, that there was a tax lien on her property that would result in forced forfeiture if she didn't sign immediately. He described 2 other properties he had been asked to look into that hadn't gone as far as filing. He described, in the flat language of a man who had stopped trying to frame things favorably, the night the fire was set, who had been in Crow's office that evening, who had left with what had been said. Harriet Voss attached a note to her letter. This is enough, it said. Come to Caldwell Thursday and bring whoever else is willing to speak. The Thursday gathering at Harriet Voss's office above the hardware store in Caldwell was not a dramatic thing, at least not in the way that dramas usually looked. It was a small, crowded room with too many chairs and a window that let in too much afternoon sun, and it smelled of old paper and the particular anxiety of people who were doing something that scared them and had decided to do it anyway. May Fraser was there. She had ridden 40 miles and she looked it, but her face was set with the resolution of a person who had finally paid a debt they'd been carrying too long. She gave her statement about the conversation at the boarding house in the measured, careful voice of someone who had been rehearsing it to herself for days, and she did not embellish, and she did not diminish, and Harriet Voss wrote it down word for word. Elsie Rowan was there. She had come without telling Roy, which meant she had a narrow window before he noticed her absence and started the kind of accounting that Mara didn't want to think about in this room. Not right now. She sat very straight, and she said what she'd heard Roy say about papers already done and situations that needed to be understood. And when she was done, her hands were shaking in her lap and she pressed them flat on her thighs and looked at the wall and breathed. Jim Carver had come, with his account of the fire and what he'd seen in the window frame, the broken glass, the entry point from the alley, the specifics of an incendiary device that didn't suggest an accident. And Amos Pell, unexpectedly, who had heard things at the livery over years in the way that a man who stays quiet and tends to animals hears things. Fragments of conversation between Crow's men. A name mentioned once. A time arranged. It wasn't much on its own. Added to what was already there, it was another piece of the shape. Harriet Voss filed a complaint with the county sheriff's office at Fletcher that same afternoon. She had copies of the fraudulent deeds, Wick's affidavit, and 4 witness statements. She was precise about what each piece of evidence established, and she was direct about what it meant. Silas Crow was arrested on a Saturday morning at his ranch by 2 county deputies. His foreman was at the gate when they arrived and tried to send them back with a message about coming back another time, and one of the deputies said they weren't delivering messages today, and they went in. Mara heard about it from Ed Holt, who had heard it from the deputy's brother, which was the standard chain for news in this part of the territory. She was behind her counter sorting a new order of thread she'd received that morning, the first new stock since the fire, chosen carefully, the colors she'd always wanted to carry but hadn't gotten around to ordering. Ed came in with the look of a man who had been waiting all morning to deliver something. "They took Crow in," he said. "She set down the thread." "When?" "About an hour ago." She stood there behind her counter with the morning light coming in through the still boarded window. The new glass hadn't come yet, but it was ordered, and she let herself feel it, the news, the weight of it, and what it meant and what it didn't mean yet, because arrest was not verdict, and verdict was not the end of everything, and she was careful not to let the relief run faster than the facts. "And Wick?" she said. "He turned himself in at Fletcher Thursday," Ed said. He was looking at her with the careful expression of a man who understood, late, that he had been one of the people who'd looked away, and who wasn't sure yet how to account for that. "I should have," he started. "Ed," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. It was not absolution exactly. It was more like acknowledgement, the recognition that people in small towns calculated their costs, and that the calculation didn't always come out where it should, and that reckonings came eventually, and that this was one of them. "Come by sometime when it's not news you're carrying," she said. "Just come by." He nodded. He went. She stood at the counter for another moment, alone in the shop with the thread she'd been sorting, and the thin strips of morning light through the boards and the smell of smoke that was still faintly there in the walls, probably always would be a little. Then she picked up the thread and went back to sorting it, color by color, lightest to darkest, the way she always did. Brennan was at the livery when he heard, and he came directly to the shop. She heard his footsteps on the boardwalk, knew them by now, without having to think about it, the particular length of his stride, the slight hesitation before the door. And she was already turned toward the door when he came in. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was nothing dramatic in the exchange, no great speech required. They had both been carrying the weight of this for long enough that the setting down of it was simply a quieter thing, a thing that didn't need ceremony. "You all right?" he said. "I think so," she said. He came to the counter and leaned on it, the way he'd been leaning on her counter since the second week, and she slid a cup of coffee toward him from the pot she always had going, and he took it. "It's not over," she said. "I know. There's a trial. It could take months. The property question—" "Harriet will sort the property question," he said. "She'll try," Mara said. "There's still a forged deed in a county record somewhere. She'll find it and she'll fight it," he said. "You know she will." Mara did know that. She had felt it in Harriet Voss's office, in the quality of the woman's attention, a mind that locked onto things and did not let go. It would be a long process, and it would cost money she didn't have in great supply, and it would require her to hold on through more uncertainty than she would have wished for. All of that was true. Also true. Silas Crow was in a county cell. Bernard Wick had told the truth. May Fraser had paid her debt, and Elsie Rowan had found something in herself that Roy Rowan had not managed to take from her yet. Jim Carver had ridden 40 miles to say what he'd seen. Amos Pell had finally unclenched the things he'd been holding. A town was made of what it did when it was afraid, but it was also made of what it did after the fear loosened, after the pressure of a powerful man's will was removed, after people had the space to look at themselves and decide whether they were willing to be the people they'd just been. That was the harder, slower work, and Ash Hollow had just started it. She looked at Brennan across the counter. This man who had arrived in a rainstorm with a broken saddle strap and had stayed without planning to and was still here, and she felt the specific precariousness of everything good, how it arrived unexpectedly, and how fragile it looked in the early stages, before it had settled into something you could trust. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." He looked at her with that direct, careful look that had not changed since the first night. "You lit the lamp," he said. "Every time they tried to put it out, you lit it again." He paused. "I just stayed close to the light." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her thread, the colors arranged in their careful order on the counter, and she picked up where she'd left off. Outside, the main street of Ash Hollow went about its business in the way of places that don't yet fully understand what has shifted in them. The slow, necessary work of a town beginning to reckon with what it had allowed, and what it was going to choose to do differently, and whether the difference would hold. The lamp in the window waited for its glass. The new glass came on a Tuesday, hauled in from Caldwell on the back of a freight wagon along with a crate of dry goods that Ed Holt had ordered and a roll of copper wire for the telegraph office. Mara had been watching for it, not anxiously but with the focused attention she gave to things she needed to see through to completion. And when the wagon came down the main street, she was already untying her apron. Jim Carver helped her fit the glass. He had a steady hand for that kind of work, and he asked nothing in return except the coffee she made while he worked. And they talked in the easy way of people who have been through something together and come out the other side changed in ways they haven't fully inventoried yet. Jim had been one of the quiet men of Ash Hollow for most of the years she'd known him. Not unkind, just contained, a man who stayed out of other people's trouble on principle. The fire had changed something in that principle, and he hadn't explained it, and she hadn't asked him to. Some shifts didn't need narrating. When the glass was fitted and sealed and the light came through it properly for the first time in weeks, Mara stood in the middle of the shop and looked at the window and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't entirely known was still held tight. "Good light," Jim said, stepping back. "Good light," she agreed. She set the lamp in the window that evening, not the spare lamp she'd been using, but the original one, the one Thomas had given her in the second year of their marriage, a solid brass thing with a good wick that she had kept clean and trimmed across years of evenings. She lit it carefully, the way she always did, with the match held steady and the globe lifted and replaced in the particular order she had performed so many times it had become a kind of ritual without ever being named one. The flame caught and held, and the light moved out through the new glass into the early dark, and Ash Hollow looked exactly the same as it always had from the street, and something about it was completely different. Harriet Voss sent word the following week. The fraudulent deed had been located in the Fletcher County records, filed under the shell company's name 16 months after Thomas's death, exactly as Wick's affidavit had described. Harriet had filed for its nullification based on Wick's testimony and the original deed that Mara had carried to Caldwell in her saddlebag. And the county magistrate, a man named Aldous Frey, who Harriet described in her letter as slow but correct, had issued a provisional ruling in Mara's favor while the full case against Crow proceeded. The land was hers, provisionally pending the trial, which would take months still to come to its conclusion. But the cloud over the title had been named and was being cleared, and Mara's name was back where it belonged in the record. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, alone in the early morning before the shop opened, and then she folded it and put it with Thomas's letters in the tin box under the floorboard, which is where things went when they were too important for the drawer. The Hasley property, Harriet also wrote, was under review. Ruth Hasley had been located. She'd gone to her sister's family in another territory, exactly as people had vaguely known, and had been contacted. She was, in Harriet's precise language, very willing to speak. 2 other properties that Wick had flagged in his affidavit were also being examined. The scope of what Silas Crow had been building, slowly and methodically across years, was larger than even Mara had understood when she was first piecing it together from her side of the counter. The trial was set for late autumn in Fletcher. Harriet Voss would argue it herself. She would not lose, which was Harriet's way of communicating confidence without promising outcomes she couldn't control. The shop settled back into its rhythms, slowly and not without friction. Some of the customers who had drifted away came back, and some of them said something about it, and some of them didn't, and Mara let both kinds be what they were. She was not keeping score, or she was trying not to. She understood that people in small towns moved in the direction of whoever held power, and that the alignment could shift when the power shifted, and that this was human nature rather than some special cruelty belonging to Ash Hollow in particular. What she was less willing to forgive, or more precisely, what she was still working on forgiving, was the specific flavor of meanness that had dressed itself up as concern. The women who had been kind to her face and vicious behind her back, not because Crow had told them to be, but because her situation had given them something they needed, a lower mark against which they could measure themselves and feel elevated. That had been its own kind of damage, separate from the arson and the fraudulent deeds, and it had done its work quietly over years. She knew she was not entirely fair about this. People were frightened, and small-town life required a constant renegotiation of status that wore people into shapes they didn't always choose. She knew that. She was working on the fairness. The work was not complete. Elsie Rowan came in on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the Caldwell statements, and this time there was something different in the way she walked through the door. Not quite confidence, not yet, but the specific quality of a person who has done something frightening and found that they survived it. "Roy knows," she said, sitting in the customer's chair. "How did he take it?" "Badly at first." Elsie looked at her hands, then made herself look up. "He raged. He said things." A pause. "He also knows that Silas Crow is in a great deal of trouble, and that the men who were closely associated with him are being looked at. Roy did business with Crow. He's frightened of what that means." She pressed her lips together. So the rage had a ceiling, which is new. Mara heard what was between the words. "Are you safe?" "I think so." "Yes." She seemed to test the answer as she gave it, checking its weight. "He's a man who needs to have things a certain way, and right now things are uncertain enough that he needs me calm more than he needs me afraid. I know that's not—" She stopped. "I know that's not the same as things being right." "No," Mara said. "It's not. I wrote to my sister in Caldwell," Elsie said. "I told her I might need to come for a visit. A longer one." She looked at Mara. "You said you'd ride me there yourself." "I meant it," Mara said. Elsie nodded slowly, with the expression of someone filing a thing away to use when they need it. She didn't say anything else about Roy or the visit or what it might mean, and Mara didn't press, because some decisions needed to be held privately for a while before they became actions, and the holding was its own form of courage. Brennan left in October. He told her 2 weeks before he went, which she appreciated, not the leaving, but the telling. He had business to finish in Fenmore, he said. There was a man named Darnell Cook running a horse operation outside Marfa, and Brennan had written him a letter in September, one that had taken him 4 days to write and 3 drafts, and which he had finally sent without reading over one more time, because reading it one more time would have meant not sending it. Darnell Cook had written back. Brennan showed her the letter without making a ceremony of it, just handed it to her across the kitchen table one evening while she was mending a pillowcase, and he was drinking his coffee. She put the mending down and read it. It was a short letter. Cook's handwriting was uneven, slightly cramped on one side in a way that might have been the aftermath of injury. He wrote that he had wondered for 2 years whether Brennan was going to find a way to disappear into the territory and never surface, and that there had been a period when he had wanted that, wanted Brennan unreachable and guilty, and carrying it forever. He wrote that the period had passed. He wrote that his left leg gave him trouble in cold weather, and that he had learned to live with that, the same way he'd had to learn to live with losing the racing circuit, which he had loved more than almost anything, and which he was done grieving now. He wrote that forgiveness was a word people used carelessly, and he was not going to use it carelessly, but that he was done being angry, and that was what it was. He wrote, "Come if you're going to come. Say what you're going to say. Then we're square and we both move on." Mara folded the letter and handed it back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You have to go," she said. "I know." He took the letter back, folded it the way it had come. "I'll be back." She looked at him. In another version of herself, in the version that had learned too well how to protect against loss, she would have said something that closed the door before he could close it on her. Something that made it her decision, her distance, her choice. She recognized the impulse. She had been living in its shadow for 3 years. "I know you'll try," she said instead, which was the honest thing. "Come back when you can." He held her gaze with the steadiness she had come to rely on, the quality that had nothing to do with certainty about outcomes and everything to do with a person who meant what they said. "That's not the same as try," he said. She let herself believe him. It felt like standing on new ice, the particular commitment of putting your weight down and trusting it to hold. She had not done it in a long time. "All right," she said. He left on a clear morning in early October with his saddlebag packed and his bay horse fresh from 2 days' rest, and Mara stood in the doorway of the shop and watched him ride down the main street of Ash Hollow and did not let herself read his departure as abandonment, which was its own quiet victory over the version of herself that had been afraid of exactly this. The lamp burned in the window. The weeks after he left were hard in the way that honest things are sometimes hard. Not devastating, not broken, just genuinely difficult in a way she had to work through rather than around. She was accustomed to being alone. She had rebuilt a life inside her aloneness, had made it functional, and sometimes even good. But there's a difference between solitude that is chosen and solitude that exists because a presence you valued has moved to a different place. And she felt the difference clearly. She worked. She kept the shop running through the sharpening autumn, took in new orders, finished old ones, managed the books with the careful attention she'd always given them. She corresponded with Harriet Voss about the trial preparations. She had coffee with May Fraser twice, and both times May seemed to be in the process of becoming a slightly different person, which Mara observed without commenting on and was quietly glad about. One afternoon in late October, she was going through the storage trunk in the bedroom, looking for the extra wool blanket, the nights having gotten cold, and she found, tucked in a folded piece of oilcloth at the bottom, a letter she had never seen before. It was in Thomas's handwriting. Her name on the front, just Mara. In the handwriting she knew better than her own. She sat on the edge of the bed with it in her hands for a long time before she opened it. She did not know when he had written it or placed it there. He had not been a man who talked about death, had not spoken in the months before his heart gave out about what he expected or feared or wanted for her after. He had done his talking in the ordinary exchanges of their life together. A comment about the garden, a plan for the north fence, an opinion on which bolt of fabric she should order next, and she had spent 3 years learning to find him in those ordinary things and then learning, slowly, to let go of needing to. The letter was 2 pages. His handwriting was neat and slightly formal, the way it always got when he was writing something he had thought about carefully. He told her that she had been the best thing in his life, which she knew and which still cost her something to read. He told her that Clara had had her mother's eyes and her mother's particular way of holding her chin up when she was thinking, which Mara had not known he noticed. He told her that the land would hold its value and that she should not sell it cheap to anyone who made her feel she had no choice. And then he wrote, "I have one thing to ask you. I know how you carry grief. I know you'll carry mine the same way you carried Clara's, thoroughly, faithfully, longer than is probably good for you. I'm not asking you not to. I'm only asking that you leave a door open. If someone comes along who sees you the way I see you, let them in. You deserve to be seen. You always have. Don't let grief convince you that you've used up your portion of good things, because you haven't, not even close." She sat with the letter until the light in the room changed and the afternoon went gray and the lamp in the shop window began to show through the wall's thin places, its light finding the gaps the way light always does. She was not sure how long she sat there. Long enough that the grief moved through her fully, the way it did when she let it. The hard current of it, the loss of Thomas and Clara, and the years she had not had with them. And then settled into something quieter, the grief that lives not as devastation, but as love with nowhere to go right now, which was what it had always really been. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box with the others, with Harriet Voss's letter about the land, with Thomas's measurement notes, with the small accumulated record of a life that was still, against considerable odds, being lived. Brennan came back on the first hard freeze of winter. She heard the horse from the shop, the familiar slow walk, the deliberate hooves, and she was already at the door by the time he tied up at the post outside. He looked different and the same. Leaner, maybe, slightly worn in the way of someone who has traveled a distance that wasn't only physical, but his eyes had something in them that was new and that she understood.
when she saw it, as a man who had said what he needed to say to the person he needed to say it to.
And had found that the world continued afterward. How was Fenmore? She said. Long, he said.
Necessary. He came up the 2 steps to the doorway. The cold was sharp, and his breath clouded in the air between them. We talked for about 3 hours, Cook and I. He stopped. He said something I've been thinking about since. He said he spent too long believing that what happened to him defined what was possible for him after. He said it took about a year before he figured out it didn't. A pause. He's doing well. The horses are good. I'm glad, she said. He looked at her steadily. I told you I'd come back. You did, she said. I meant it then, and I mean it now, he said. And there was nothing in his voice except the simple weight of a person stating what was true. She stepped back from the doorway to let him in, and he came in out of the cold, and she put the coffee on, and the lamp burned in the window with the new glass carrying its light cleanly out into the frozen evening. Outside, the first snow of the year was beginning to fall. Not heavily, just the early light snow that comes to frontier country as a kind of announcement, saying winter is real and it is here. The main street of Ash Hollow was quiet in the way of towns buttoning themselves up against the cold, lanterns showing in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the ordinary, resilient machinery of people making warmth in cold places. There are things that only become visible from the far side of them. The long duration of grief looked different tomorrow now than it had in its middle. Not less real, not smaller, but clarified. The way a road looks different from its end than it does when you are walking it and cannot see where it goes. She had not known, in the worst years of her solitude, that she was also becoming something. That the woman who absorbed cruelty without breaking was developing a quality of unbreakableness that was not hardness. It was more specific than hardness, more useful. It was the knowledge, earned slowly across years of proof, that she could survive difficult things without becoming smaller for having survived them. What the people of Ash Hollow had seen when they looked at her was a woman diminished by circumstances. What the circumstances had actually produced was something different, a woman who knew precisely what she was worth because she had tested it the hard way, over time, under pressure, without anyone standing close enough to shore her up. Silas Crow had looked at her and seen a mark. He had seen the grief and the sighs and the aloneness and calculated that these things added up to someone who could be moved. He had been wrong about the arithmetic. He had mistaken the appearance of vulnerability for the thing itself, and the error had eventually cost him everything he'd been building. She thought, stirring the coffee with her back to Brennan, who had settled into his chair at the table with the ease of a man returning to a place he'd already decided was his. She thought about what it would have taken to make Silas Crow right. How small she would have had to be. How many times she would have had to accept the verdict other people handed her about her own life and act accordingly. Dim herself to fit the space they'd assigned her. Leave when they wanted her to leave. Sell when they wanted her to sell. It was not the worst possible life. She could have lived inside it. Some people did, and it was not weakness that put them there, but simply the specific weight of accumulated pressure over time, which could bend anyone if applied long enough at the right angles. She had bent. She wanted to be honest about that. There had been mornings when the cruelty landed and she had felt herself diminish under it, felt the pull of just agreeing with what everyone seemed to think, felt the exhaustion of being the only person willing to fight for the version of herself that she knew was true. She had lit the lamp and gone to bed, and not been sure in the morning whether she had the energy to keep going. What she had learned across all of it was that you did not need to be sure. You needed to be willing. The difference was important. Certainty was a luxury, and courage was not certainty. It was motion despite uncertainty, the decision to take the next step when you could not see the ground clearly. She had not always been certain. She had usually been willing. That was enough. It had always been enough. There's something I need to tell you, Brennan said from the table. She turned. He had his hands around the coffee cup she'd set in front of him, and he was looking at her with the directness that had been there since the first night. I'm not passing through anymore, he said. I haven't been for a while. I just needed to say it plainly. She looked at him. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, he said. I know where you've been. I know what it cost you to stay open after everything that tried to close you. He paused. I'm just telling you that I'm not going anywhere. That's the whole thing. That's all I'm saying. She stood at the kitchen stove with the coffee pot in her hand,
and the lamp burning in the front room, and the snow falling quiet and small outside. And she thought about Thomas's letter, the door he had asked her to leave open, the trust that had been placed in her to keep living even after everything had tried to make living feel like betrayal. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He held her gaze, and the thing between them that had been building since a rainy night and a stranger with a broken saddle strap settled into something quieter and more solid, the way water settles after it finds its level. "The trial's in 3 weeks," she said. "I know." "Harriet says Crow's lawyer is trying to delay it." "Harriet won't let him," Brennan said. "No," Mara agreed. "She won't." She poured her own coffee and sat down across from him, and the kitchen was warm against the cold outside, and the lamp in the window went on doing what it had always done, holding its light up against the dark, keeping the place looking like something alive was inside it, making it possible to find your way home. She had lit it first for Thomas. She had kept it lit for Clara. She had lit it through 3 years of solitude for herself, because she had needed to see it from the street when she was coming home in the dark, had needed the proof that she belonged somewhere. Now it burned for all of those things, and for the man at her table, and for the town that was slowly, imperfectly, beginning to understand what it had overlooked. It burned for Elsie Rowan, who was practicing the quiet bravery of deciding who she wanted to be. It burned for May Fraser, who had finally said the true thing. It burned for everyone who had ever needed a light in a window to know that warmth existed and that there was still time to walk toward it. The frontier gave nothing easily. It ground people down and made them hard or made them wise, and sometimes both, and sometimes neither. What it could not do, what no amount of cruelty or isolation or accumulated weight of other people's indifference could do, was make a person small who had decided not to be small. That decision lived inside the person and not in the territory around them, and it could not be taken by arson or fraud or whispered cruelty or the studied contempt of people who needed someone beneath them. Mara Ellsworth had always known that. She had lost sight of it sometimes, in the worst mornings of the worst years. But she had always found her way back. The snow fell, the coffee was warm, the lamp burned in the window, and the light went out through the new glass into the cold dark of the street, and it was visible a long way off, the way good lights always are.